Tonight, fragile hopes for a deal in the desert as leaders gather in Saudi Arabia for talks on Ukraine. President Zelenskyy arrives in Jeddah and faces a painful choice: bend the knee to Donald Trump or lose his country. Well, back here, the Labour MP Mike Amesbury stands down after receiving a prison sentence for assault and triggers a by-election. An absolute insult and a betrayal. The daughter of murdered MP Sir David Amess on the Home Secretary's decision to refuse an inquiry into her father's killing. Reform UK locked in a power struggle. We'll speak to a political donor toying with backing the party despite the infighting, because he says Nigel Farage looks like a statesman. And one man who relishes a power struggle. Rumours that Dominic Cummings is speaking to Nigel Farage. Could the man once described as a career psychopath be back? Should we be afraid? Very afraid. All that and more with our panel, Muroki and Jonathan Ashworth, who'll be with us for the next hour. It's Monday, I'm Sophy Ridge, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Well, we're going to get to all the politics in a moment because there is a lot of it. But first, just wanted to bring you an update on a moving story we've been covering today, because a cargo ship collided with a tanker carrying aviation fuel this morning, causing both vessels to explode into flames. And of the 37 people on board the two ships, it's been reported by a local MP that one is unaccounted for, the rest are safe. But of course, the extent of the environmental impact is yet to be determined. So here's what we know so far. The collision happened when a cargo ship called the Solong ran into a tanker chartered by the US military, which was sitting at anchor off the East Yorkshire coast. Now, other ships in the area and the Royal National Lifeboat Institute responded to the incident. More than 30 casualties were then brought ashore shortly afterwards. And it all happened 10 miles off the coast of Hull just before 10 this morning, during what's been described as foggy conditions. 4 lifeboat crews were called to the incident from Bridlington, Mablethorpe, Skegness and Cleethorpes, with the last of those stood down shortly after an hour later. And the website Marine Traffic, which monitors ships moving around the globe, shows the Stena Immaculate in the centre here, stationary, and then coming from the top of your screen, you can also see the Solong. It then captured the moment the two ships collided. We can speak now to our Chief North of England correspondent, Greg Milam, who is in Grimsby. Greg, what's the current situation?
Well, it does appear this evening that almost remarkably there has been no loss of life as a result of that collision. When you look at those images of the intensity of that fire, we're told by the ambulance service here that they assessed 36 people from those two vessels. None of them required hospital treatment. There is some conflicting reporting about whether there is someone still unaccounted for. That's not clear tonight. But certainly they were fortunate in that the number of vessels, a vessel taking people to wind farms, for example, was in the area and able to ferry some of those back, some pilot vessels close by to get more than 30 people back to shore safely. That a plus point out of everything that was happening. We know that container was on contract to the US military, carrying jet fuel, according to the company that manages it. They say in that collision, the cargo tank was ruptured and that jet fuel was released into the sea. There were multiple explosions and the crew decided to abandon that ship as a result of what was going on. We also know that the cargo ship, the Solong, was carrying among its cargo 15 containers of sodium cyanide. So again, you can see what they're dealing with, and that work to contain those fires is continuing 10 miles off the coast here. A very difficult operation for those teams out there trying to bring under control those fires and get a handle on what's going on. Because then the focus, of course, will be on the investigation into how this could possibly have happened, and also the possibility of any environmental damage as a result of that jet fuel or any other chemicals on those vessels coming ashore in some very sensitive wildlife areas here. So a lot still going on, but it seems, thankfully, no loss of life as a result of that collision.
Greg, thank you very much indeed. Greg Milam there. Of course, if there's any updates on that moving story throughout the programme, we will bring them to you. Now, today, Donald Trump has been president for 50 days, and in those 50 days, everything's changed. Now, we could start this programme talking about any one of those changes: the decision to cut 83% of US contracts for overseas aid or to withdraw from the climate agreement in Paris. But the change that I did want to talk to you about tonight that has a direct impact on the UK and other countries around the world too is Donald Trump's changing attitude to America's allies. You know, the old alliances were founded on principle, on democracy, and they're no longer important for Donald Trump, it seems. He's a much more transactional president than that. You know, Canada, supposedly America's best of friends, should now be America's 51st state, according to Trump.
Canada, in this particular, why would we pay $200 billion a year in subsidies to Canada when they're not a state? You do that for a state, but you don't do that for somebody else's country. So I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
Is he serious? I mean, who knows? But it does feel quite important what we were saying there. You wouldn't do that for someone else's country. This is a reaction for the incoming Prime Minister.
Donald Trump.
Donald Trump.
Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, as we know, has put, as the Prime Minister just said, unjustified tariffs on what we build, on what we sell, on how we make a living. He's attacking Canadian families, workers and businesses, and we cannot let him succeed. And we won't. We won't.
And this attitude matters for Europe too, that of course has backed America in some controversial wars. Is Europe still an ally of America, or do we have to go it alone?
Well, I'm not going to make security guarantees beyond very much. We're going to have Europe do that because it's in, we're talking about Europe as their next door neighbor. But we're going to make sure everything goes well.
Like Canada, European politicians are grappling with the new world order and whether they can rely on the United States.
I want to believe that the US will stand by our side, but we have to be ready for that not to be the case. We need to be able to recognise the Russian threat and better defend ourselves in order to deter such attacks.
And all of this has just got me thinking. Donald Trump's gripe with Europe and Canada and Mexico to some extent is that these are countries that benefit from their relationship with the United States, ignoring the fact that America benefits from these alliances as well. But he feels these countries rely on the United States, whether economically or through defence. And relying on something in the Donald Trump world signifies weakness. And of course, this is a president who respects strength, which perhaps explains what he said about Vladimir Putin.
I think he'll keep his word. I think I've spoken to him. I've known him for a long time now. I've known him. We had to go through the Russian hoax together. That was not a good thing. I've known him for a long time now, and I think he will. I don't believe he's going to violate his word.
I mean, that, of course, is Donald Trump talking about Putin. A year ago, it would have been unimaginable to have had an American president talking about Russia in that way. But alliances are shifting, and at the sharp end of this is Ukraine. Talks on a peace deal are continuing this week in Saudi Arabia, with Marco Rubio there today for the United States. It's a new world that all leaders are reeling from, but perhaps no more than President Zelenskyy. Our international correspondent Alice Rossi has this report from Jeddah.
Thank you. The stakes for Ukraine could not be higher as President Zelenskyy arrived in Saudi Arabia. His meetings are a prelude to negotiations between Ukrainian and American officials to mend the relationship. President Zelenskyy will not be part of the talks. The US will be represented by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He says it's important Ukraine is prepared to do difficult things. The talks are taking place here in the port city of Jeddah. Saudi Arabia is emerging as a major power player. It's seen by both the United States and Russia as a neutral venue, and much is riding on these negotiations. The ambition from the delegations is that by the time they conclude, they hope that they will at least have the shape of what a ceasefire deal will look like.
Your country's in big trouble.
Can I answer?
No,
but there is a lot of work to do before that. Remember this?
You're not winning. You're not winning this. You have a damn good chance of coming out okay because of us.
Mr. President,
A diplomatic spat to end all diplomatic spats in the Oval Office, which left US-Ukrainian relations in tatters. And in Ukraine, the consequences of the breakdown have been catastrophic. An uptick in Russian attacks after Washington cut off weapons shipments and intelligence sharing.
We want to do anything we can to get Ukraine to be serious about getting something done. You know, I say they don't have the cards. Nobody really has the cards. Russia doesn't have the cards. They don't have. What you have to do is you have to make a deal, and you have to stop the killing.
But the Russian position is far from clear. The Kremlin saying its objectives remain the same. It keeps all the territory, and Ukraine is demilitarized.
An awful lot of the evidence, including the language about this is Ukraine's fault they started the war, which is demonstrably a lie, that kind of thing does not suggest to me brilliant deal-making. That suggests to me that America has sadly begun to take sides with Vladimir Putin rather than with the democratic elected government in Ukraine.
What the United States appears to be hoping for from this meeting is a compliant Ukraine after its public dressing down. But by weakening its position, there may now be less incentive for Russia to make any compromises. Alex Rossi, Sky News, Jeddah.
Let's bring in our duo for this evening, shall we? The broadcaster and former government advisor, Muroki, and the former Labour MP, now Chief Executive of Labour Together, Jonathan Ashworth. It's great to have you both with us. Thanks for being with us today. 50 days of Trump. I mean, it's a tightrope for Keir Starmer, isn't it? It's fair to say.
Well, I think what Keir Starmer has done very successfully is get the case for Europe back on the table. If you remember 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a suggestion that Europe would have no involvement in future discussions about Ukraine. That's unacceptable, because the security of Ukraine is about the security of Europe, which is also about the security of the United Kingdom. And I think Keir Starmer's leadership on the world stage, building a rapport with President Trump, has paid off in as much as the European voice has been heard. He's been right to talk about building a coalition of the willing. Keir Starmer's right to increase defence expenditure, but he's got to continue to talk to the White House, to President Trump, and he's got to convince President Trump that he is not an equal of Putin. Putin is much weaker, in a much weaker position than the President of the United States. President Trump has more cards in his hand. He does not have to give in or be seen to allow Ukraine to give in to Putin. Putin is not as strong as some of the messaging from the White House suggests they think he is.
Do you agree with what Jonathan's saying there?
Well, I think it's right that leaders and politicians of all parties do support the Prime Minister as he goes out and tries to, one, sort of placate Trump, which is something that he unfortunately does have to do. And also, yes, I do think we should increase defence spending. However, I'm not sure what sort of the numbers mean. I don't think we've been clear about what increasing defence spending, what that translates into. We've heard about all these tens of thousands of troops, we would be willing to put in Ukraine. However, we have a diminished army, and the army numbers have been diminishing over years. So we are in a compromised position already as it is. So it's not really clear what exactly that plan would look like. But I do think we have to accept that the world order is significantly changing, and these systems and these coalitions and alliances that have been in place for so long, they're not to be taken for granted. Actually, they can change at the whims of a leader, and I think we really have to appreciate that perhaps it is time to move away from Europe's reliance on America, and I think that is now a reality.
I guess, you're saying there, Jonathan, about how Keir Starmer's managed to get Europe like a seat at the table again to kind of make Europe relevant again. And, I do accept that to a point, but then it doesn't really feel like Donald Trump has actually compromised or anything yet, right? He hasn't said he's going to be providing the backstop that Europe has asked when it comes to peacekeeping forces. Do you think that it's actually made any real difference? Well,
obviously discussions, negotiations, diplomacy is ongoing, and 90% of diplomacy traditionally is done behind closed doors. We're in very untraditional times, however, but traditionally a lot goes on behind closed doors that we don't get to see. But obviously the United Kingdom has to continue offering itself as this bridge between the US and Europe. That's strategically important for us. You're absolutely right. The peace dividend that we've relied on since the end of the Cold War is now exhausted. It is gone. We've got to make some big, serious decisions. Secondly, it is going to force upon us some big decisions about our economy. Because what's going on in Wall Street at the moment is their confidence is collapsing. They're now speculating about a potential recession. One banker I was reading was talking about there was exuberance a month ago. There's now despair because these tariffs and trade wars are not going to be good for the US economy, and they're not going to be good for the global economy.
What's your view on 50 days of Donald Trump?
Well, I think it's quite curious that people are almost shocked that he's doing what he said he would, which is probably a damning indictment of politicians when they do what they said that they would do. My view is that he's probably disturbed things far too early. He's disturbed the global world order for a start, which is no small feat. But actually, I'm not actually sure what he's delivering for the American people yet. You know, I was looking at an article earlier saying the Department of Justice has started an investigation into the price of eggs because they are extortionate at the moment in America, up to $10 per a dozen eggs, which is about just under £8, because they've had this massive bird flu crisis. And when you look at the debates that are going on sort of amongst the American public, the price of eggs has really become the kind of symbolic of the state of the economy. So I'd like to see him actually saying something about what ordinary people are going through.
It's a good point. You know, we talk a lot about these kind of highfalutin principles, but actually price of eggs, that's the kind of election decider, isn't it? It's true.
Well, that's why the Democrats lost, because of inflation and prices.
Yeah, this is it, exactly. And we'll have more from you in just one moment. And of course, the ongoing shift in the world order that we've been speaking about is sure to feature in tomorrow's papers. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be The Guardian's deputy political editor, Jessica Elgott, and The Sun's chief political correspondent, Jack Elson. We do have some breaking news to bring you now, because the Labour MP Mike Amesbury is standing down, triggering a by-election in Runcorn and Helsby. Talking about this some more with us is our political correspondent, Amanda Akers, who joins us now. Just tell us a bit more about the story, what's happened.
Yes, so he said he'll stand down as soon as possible, and it follows a rather extraordinary spectacle we saw where Mike Amesbury, serving Labour MP, drunkenly assaulted a constituent in the street last October. There was CCTV footage that was released of the incident. There seemed to have been some kind of altercation about the closure of a local bridge, and Amesbury punched this man, who's called Paul Fellows, in the head, and then proceeded to continue to attack him when he was lying on the ground, and then shouted at him saying, "You won't threaten your MP again, will you?" There was a court case last month, and Mike Amesbury admitted the assault and apologised, but he was sentenced to 10 weeks in jail initially. That was then suspended to a community sentence involving 200 hours of unpaid work and so on. But he did spend 3 nights in jail before that appeal, and that sentence was suspended. Now, he's now made that decision to stand down as the MP for Runcorn and Helsby, which avoids the kind of need for a messy process with a drawn-out recall petition where 10% of constituents would have to say they wanted him to go. He had already been suspended from the Labour Party over all of this. But it's interesting because it'll be a by-election, the first one of Sir Keir Starmer's premiership. Everyone's always very interested in by-elections as a way of kind of taking the temperature of how the government's doing, especially this early on in their administration. And this constituency, historically, has been fairly safe Labour area, although it has been Tory in the past. And Amesbury was elected first in 2017, and then last time around he had a pretty strong majority, 14,000. But the party that came second was Reform. So this is really a kind of moment where we'll see whether all of that surging popularity of Reform in the polls actually translates to people being willing to vote for them at the ballot box. Of course, there are very specific, mad local circumstances surrounding this vote anyway. And of course, Reform have troubles of their own with the split over the treatment of Rupert Lowe, one of their MPs being suspended. But I think it will be a really interesting one to watch.
Thanks very much indeed, Amanda. Right, I just want to go bring back in our panel, if we can, to going to whiz across and have a talk to them, because there's someone I did want to ask about this. There's been a bit of speculation about you in this by-election. So spill the beans, what's going on?
Well, I was rather hoping Sky News would ask me to be the replacement for Kay Burley and give me my own breakfast show. Is
this a pitch?
It certainly is for the people back there. I'm available. I often used to come on in the breakfast show, so I'd love to be the presenter. Look, Mike Amesbury's clearly done the right thing by standing down, absolutely. But I think you're more likely to see Lord Lucan riding Shergar down Runcorn High Street than see me as the candidate.
That feels like a very Boris Johnson thing to say when he then went and did the thing that
I nearly swore then when you compared me to Boris Johnson. Look,
it's not a denial.
I'm not going to be the candidate in Runcorn. Come off it. But look, I would say this. The There were slightly different boundaries. The seat had a different name, but that seat went Tory in 2010 under David Cameron. It's called Weaver Vale in them days. If the Tories are making any progress, they should be looking to win a seat like this. It's the sort of seat David Cameron won. We won it back eventually, but Cameron's Tories held this for 7 years, that seat.
I mean, it is going to be an interesting by-election, isn't it? Like, putting aside the circumstances of it, it might tell us quite a lot about where politics is right now.
Yeah, I'm not familiar necessarily with the demographics in this particular constituency, but what we do know is Reform did come second, and they are polling very highly in the polls. That's been increasing over time, with a slight dip maybe recently. And it will be interesting to see whether what's going on with Reform at the moment is sort of, if that's going to affect how the public are viewing Reform, and if so, in what sense? Because actually, it might make Nigel Farage look like a strong leader. You know, there's this person, Rupert Lowe, this MP of theirs, who has kind of tried to stand up against Nigel Farage, and he's basically kicked him out. So I don't know, maybe the people who would vote Reform might see that as a show of strength and might be more inclined to support Nigel Farage, but we'll see.
Hold that thought, because coming up next on the Politics Hub. The row within Reform UK intensifies, with the MP at the centre of it all. We've just been talking about him, Rupert Lowe, and the party leader, Nigel Farage, both speaking out once again this evening. We'll be hearing from a party donor. That's next.
Over there, to your left. There have been airstrikes every day. Hezbollah are very sensitive about us showing any pictures, and we're being hurried away right now. It felt akin to riding into some sort of Armageddon. Many other areas have been hit badly. There are shells coming in every few minutes. Hear that whistle and that crunch? We know that they're coming from the south of the city, where there's a column of Russian armoury. I'm Alex Crawford, and I'm Sky's special correspondent based in Istanbul. It's trying to hit us. That's it. It got us then. There's a lot of action going on. A lot of hits still. We were the first journalists and the only outsiders to reach the site of the attack several weeks after it happened.
We found from the missile.
It's very difficult to see what around here could be conceived of as a legitimate military target. Only about half a mile from the Turkish coast, a boat seriously overcrowded. This is one of the most severe viruses in the world. Clearly not had very much to eat at all, a lot of them extremely thin and very frail. Look at that sheet of flames, and that has happened within minutes, and now it's coming from both sides, and it's moving this way.
The world's largest falls now down to a trickle in places.
I can't imagine how much plastic is lying at the bottom of this huge lake. Whoa! Getting up close and personal with a rhino.
This is what makes the job so fantastic.
We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting. Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
Hello, welcome back. We can go straight now to Central Lobby, because the Prime Minister has been addressing what's known as the Parliamentary Labour Party tonight, which is basically Labour MPs. Now, these meetings are off camera, but our political correspondent Rob Powell's had a glass pressed against the wall. Rob, what have you been hearing?
Hi, Sophie. Yeah, pretty rare for the Prime Minister to address these meetings, but we had Cabinet Ministers, the Chancellor, the Home Secretary, peers, MPs, all trooping into the committee room upstairs from here to hear from Keir Starmer and also to ask him questions. Part of what the Prime Minister said was updating the party on what he's been doing on defence, the talks he's been having with President Trump and Volodymyr Zelenskyy over Ukraine. But I think the newest bit, and maybe the area where there is the bigger potential for tension within the party, was on benefits and welfare. We know that potentially next week there will be a big announcement about how to take billions of pounds out of the welfare bill. And the Prime Minister in this speech said that he believed that they'd found themselves in the worst of all worlds at the moment, with the wrong incentives, discouraging people from work, with the taxpayer funding a spiralling bill of £70 billion a year by 2030. Now, he talked about a wasted generation in terms of the 1 in 8 young people, he said, who are not in education, employment or training, and talked about that being unsustainable, about that being indefensible, and it being unfair as well. So I think setting a pretty hard tone in terms of language, and we know that there is some slight nervousness on the Labour backbenches about what could be coming in terms of trying to squeeze the welfare bill and essentially, as it boils down to it, potentially taking benefit payments and welfare payments away from people. Now, how this usually works with these parliamentary Labour Party meetings is that MPs and peers troop out and say that it all went down like a nest of singing birds, and then later on they start sending decidedly more spiky WhatsApp messages to journalists to say what they actually think. Today was no different. I think I counted 3 goods, 1 fantastic, 1 brilliant and 1 marvellous, although no one could tell whether that was said sarcastically or not. But what MPs did say about what the Prime Minister put out there about benefits was that essentially the tone was one of reassurance, that it would be something that is done with Labour values, one MP said, and one that was done with compassion. So, look, I think there is worry that you've got a Labour government coming in, cutting the aid budget on one hand, and cutting and now potentially cutting benefits as well. One further point: the meeting was packed, and actually 2 MPs that turned up about 15 minutes late, Diane Abbott and Richard Bergen from Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, didn't get let in. So one of them said, "If your name's not on the list, you're not coming in," and they both toddled off for a cup of tea instead.
Oh, there you go. Love that detail. Rob, thank you very much indeed. Now, we were just discussing this before the break, but the bitter war of words between Reform UK leader Nigel Farage and the party's suspended MP Rupert Lowe has intensified once again this evening. The MP for Great Yarmouth was reported to police by Reform on Friday. It was after allegations of bullying made by 2 women and threats made against the party's chair. He denies all the allegations against him. Now, he was speaking to Dan Wootton on his Outspoken podcast. Meanwhile, the party's leader, Nigel Farage, has said all of this is a huge distraction.
You know what? I could do without this. It's a huge distraction for the party, for me, for everybody. I've spent 7 months since the general election trying to get this party match fit to fight the local elections in England on May the 1st, and that is still my focus.
Of course, Reform has been storming in the polls recently, but last month the party's topped a Sky News YouGov poll for the first time, just edging out Labour. And it's early days, but how's the internal row cut through? Now, Mohammed Amersi is a businessman and a previous Conservative Party donor who recently paid money to attend a Reform dinner. I spoke to him about what he thinks of all of this a bit earlier. Thank you very much for being on the programme. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for having me.
So,
it's a pleasure.
You've previously given money to the Conservative Party, but in January you paid £25,000 to sit with Nigel Farage at a Reform fundraiser. So I guess my first question is, does this mean you're now a Reform supporter?
Not yet. What I decided to do is, first of all, I followed Farage quite a lot on his Brexit campaign, and I saw that he was somebody who could really engage with the people up and down, left and right in the country. So I was always keeping an eye on him. And then what really interested me the most about him was his transatlantic ties to President Trump and the Trump team, especially Elon Musk and others. And I said, look, with the way the world is evolving today, you will definitely need a strong UK leader who can connect with the US administration. So that intrigued me about him. I was invited to the Trump inauguration. I was there in Washington. And then Nigel, Aaron Banks and Nick Candy threw a party for the inauguration as well. And they were kind enough to invite me there. And all the time I saw that he was very popular in the US and increasing in popularity here. The membership numbers started to look interesting for Reform. But, you know, it's still a little bit early days. The fundraiser at Oswald's was magical. The atmosphere in the room was electric. And I saw him at close quarter and I said, look, he really has changed and he looks like a statesman now.
Because you went to that Reform fundraiser, then you went to the Conservative Party London conference a few days later. So what's going on? You're kind of like flirting with both parties.
No, so in business we call it optionality.
Right.
And it's always good to have options because you just don't know how the world and the UK will shake up in the next 2-3 years. So I'm keeping, a foot in the door. I have not given up my Tory party membership. I'm still a Tory party member. In fact, only this morning I had a coffee with Dominic Johnson, the co-chair of the Tory party as well.
Are they trying to woo you back then?
No, it's not like that at all. Absolutely not. So, we were trying to understand what Reform wanting, what the Tory party is wanting. They knew that I'd been to the London event. They asked me my views on what I thought of Kemi Badenoch. Was she electable?
What is your view on that then?
So I think it's early days. It's early days for Farage. It's a little early days for Kemi. And for Farage, what happened with Rupert Lowe over the weekend was unfortunate. But I come from the world of business, venture capital. And when 5 new people all come together in one room, when they have never worked together before, it is always possible to see this sort of things happening. But what I would have really liked to have happened is for Nigel Farage to take leadership in his hands, bring these 2 people in the room and say, we got to sort it out. Just as Trump sorted it out 2 days before this spat between Mark Rubio and Elon Musk.
Because infighting like this is going to have an impact on Reform at the election.
Of course.
You think it will?
And I said that in the Telegraph. I said that they will be unelectable unless they can unite. That is key.
Well, it's only 5 of them.
I know.
They've already got
I thought Zia
suspended
Yusuf
one.
should never have gone to the police. I think he should have gone to Farage and said, this is what has happened. Can we sit around the room and sort this out?
There's 2 sides to this, right? So Nigel Farage and the chairman of Reform say they're acting responsibly by suspending Rupert Lowe, that they're doing the right thing, that they're professionalising. Rupert Lowe says, actually, some of these allegations aren't even about me. This is vindictive because I criticised Nigel Farage. Yeah. What do you think? Whose side are you on?
So I think both are right, but this is where leadership comes in.
So you think it is, I guess, a kind of personal thing towards Rupert Lowe, then, you think?
It's always about personalities when people come in together for the first time, because they've got to rub against each other, test each other, and then see how they can work together. And this is something that I would say is more of a storm in a teacup.
Okay.
And in a startup situation, I think that they will regroup and they will understand that united they are stronger and better, okay?
Will you donate to Reform in future?
It's an interesting question. I would rather continue doing that and continue supporting the Tory party as well.
Because it is fair to say you've had a bumpy relationship, to put it lightly, recently with the Conservative Party, right? You lost a high-profile battle with a former Conservative MP. Another Conservative MP made allegations against you in Parliament. I mean, some people looking at this might be like, look, this is sour grapes from you on this.
No, it's not at all. So it's an isolated group of people, and you probably don't follow me on Twitter, and why would you? But if you want to, you can see exactly what was happening. People in Parliament today have abused privilege by using manufactured false intelligence reports on somebody, and then it is spoken about in Parliament without any compunction, without any responsibility for it. And this has to change. I am reasonably resilient, old enough to be able to take this in my stride, but other people would be seriously broken by this. So this we cannot allow to continue. It undermines our democracy.
Well, let's talk again to Mercy and Jonathan, shall we? So, I mean, you were talking about it a bit earlier, this extraordinary public row that we've seen between Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage. They're both got completely different perspectives on this. It's quite hard and unclear to get to the bottom of what actually went on. But do you think it's damaging for Reform?
See, I'm not convinced it will be, to be honest. I mean, first of all, let's be honest, most people can't name a few Reform, I mean, they have 5, but they have 4 now, but most people couldn't even name who Rupert Lowe was, like the average member of the public, to be honest. He's known Nigel Farage or Richard Tice in terms of sort of his profile, so I'm not sure it will have massive cut through. And as I was saying earlier, people might see this as a show of strength on the part of Nigel Farage, and he has said he's trying to, make the party a more sort of professional, palatable, maybe outfit. And it is true that Rupert Lowe has said things that might go against that, like he has called for mass deportations. I think he said something like, if it means we deport 1 million people, that's fine. And so I can see why Nigel Farage might think, OK, this is somebody who's perhaps not going to help us get to our mission of being more electable and capitalising on the support we have. So I think the by-election that we will see maybe will be a good sort of test for whether that has cut through.
What do you think?
Well, I mean, it's just a reminder that the Reform, they're a clown show, aren't they? And that Nigel Farage, I mean, he wants to run the country. I mean, this suggests he couldn't run a bath. I mean, it's a complete shambles. In the end, though, Reform have to be held to account on the fact that they want to introduce charges for the NHS. I don't believe people want to pay 15 grand for a hip replacement or a knee replacement. And then he will wave the white flag at Russia. So they're the big issues which I think voters will be concerned about with Reform.
What's the specific policy on charging for the NHS?
He said very clearly that he wants to see a social insurance system where people...
That's just comments that Nigel Farage... It wasn't in the manifesto, though, was it?
Nigel Farage... He's the leader.
But I just think that is quite an important clarification. That wasn't in their manifesto. These are comments that Nigel Farage has made in the past.
He's the leader. I tell you what, if Keir Starmer had said that as a leader, you would have been asking me about it. And every time I came on your show on a Sunday...
I've asked Reform about these comments as well previously, don't get me wrong. I think it's a valid line of question, but I just want to clarify...
He wants to introduce a social insurance system and that people should be charged like the French model. That is the quote he gave to The Telegraph over Christmas. He's the leader. We know that if you fall out with him, he kicks you out. So, look, I think the next election, it's going to be, you've either got Labour or a potential Tory Reform coalition with charging in the NHS as the price of that coalition. And I think the argument the next election will be...
Why is support so high, then? Why is support
so
high?
Really.
Well, it is high, actually. And actually, in some polls, it has been higher than for Labour. So if people are so distressed about what Nigel Farage is saying, he clearly wouldn't be... Well, the party clearly wouldn't be polling so high.
That's why my colleagues in the Labour Party need to continue to remind people that he wants to introduce charges to the NHS and he would wave the white flag to Putin and leave... What's Nigel Farage's defence policy when it comes to Russia? Surrender. That's what Labour's going to be reminding people in the run to the next election about Reform.
OK, thanks both very much indeed. Great to speak to you about this. Coming up next on the Politics Hub. I'll be speaking to Sir David Amess's daughter after her calls for a public inquiry into his death were rejected by the government. The decision, she says, is a betrayal. welcome back. Now, on the 15th of October 2021, the MP, Sir David Amess, was stabbed to death during a constituency surgery in Leigh-on-Sea. A review into his murder found his killer was a follower of Islamic State and had also been released from the Prevent anti-terror programme too quickly. Well, today his daughter Katie has called the government's decision to reject a public inquiry into his killing an insult and a betrayal of her father's memory. Katie is here with us. She's joined by the family spokesperson, Rad Saiger, as well. Thank you both for being with us, first of all. Katie, it must be re-traumatising for you to have to go through these multiple media interviews.
Yeah.
So I wanted to say that, we really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
It's been a big day. The Home Secretary rejected a public inquiry into the death of your father. What's your reaction to that?
Utter disbelief, and we're completely heartbroken all over again, and we just feel betrayed, ignored, let down, and also angry, because why are we having to fight so hard for an inquiry? This inquiry should have happened immediately after his death. That was in 2021, it's now 2025. I asked the Conservative government, I've asked the Labour government, nobody wants to help me, and I just don't understand why.
Can I ask, how did you find out the news that they'd rejected your call for a public inquiry?
So the Prime Minister asked us to have a meeting with him. And so we were thinking, oh, this is, something positive. And then Rad said, would it be okay if we bought press? And they said no. So that's when I started to think something funny is going on, because they just announced Nottingham and they had press there. So I started to think maybe this isn't going to be a good outcome. So then Rad said, OK, we understand we're not allowed press. Could you just explain what the meeting is going to be about? And that is the response that we got back.
Yeah. And how did you feel when you heard it?
My whole body started shaking with just anger and just completely bereft all over again, that I was reading these same words over and over again, pretending that the paper review that they did years ago answered all the questions, when it answered no questions. There was no investigation, nobody was interviewed. All they did was go through timelines and email logs and make guesses as to what was going on. The fact that they're still insinuating that I should be happy with that and go away when they immediately launched an inquiry into Southport, it's just utter disbelief. And then, of course, floods of tears, and then having to tell my mum, check your emails, we're not getting an inquiry, and it's just, we're heartbroken.
You mentioned there the kind of paper inquiry that you said, and it is important for me to put the government's side to this, right? So Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, said it's hard to see how an inquiry would be able to go beyond what has been reviewed in the trial, the Prevent Learning review, the coroner's report, as well as Lord Anderson and Essex Police's forthcoming conclusions. I mean, I guess that is what they're saying, that these things have been looked into previously. The Prevent Learning review recently published. The coroner, for example, decided not to resume an inquest after the criminal trial because there were no additional questions that could be answered through an investigation of this kind that had not already been considered as part of the trial.
Well, first of all, the coroner was considering doing an inquest, but after the government wrote to him a 7-page document, he changed his mind. So that was government interference. And I know there's been a legal trial, and we know who did the murder, but we don't know why he was allowed to do it and why he was allowed to go back into the community for 6 years to carry on planning this attack. The Prevent Learning review that they're talking about, if everything had been fixed in 2022 or whenever they did that review, why did Southport then happen a year and a half later? If all those questions had been answered and there was nothing to see here, how comes the same thing happened? Because it's the same profile of person, a lone person, self-radicalising. The members of the public are reporting him, they're taking them out for coffee, the person saying, I'm not a terrorist, and then they're just letting him go. That review that they did means nothing. They did no investigations, they just looked at paperwork. I don't know if Rad, if you want to...
Yes, Sophie, so none of what's come before answers the family's questions as to how Harbour Ali was allowed to carry on and do what he did. So the other question, of course, is who made the decision to release him? And more importantly, what's going to be done to make sure this never happens again? As Katie says, if everything has been done that could have been done, we can learn no more, why on earth are they announcing an inquiry into Southport? And the two cases are absolutely identical. We completely support the Southport families, but if you're going to have an inquiry into Southport, you can't then say to the Amess family, oh no, there's nothing to see here, there's nothing more to do. So we've been through the government's case, and with all due respect to them, we think they're wrong, and we will be going to see the Prime Minister on Wednesday to explain why we think that they've got this wrong and to invite them to reconsider.
You said that you thought there was government interference with the coroner. I don't know.
So basically the coroner said, OK, I'm open to resuming the inquest. He wrote to the perpetrator, he wrote to Essex Police, and he wrote to the government. The perpetrator said, I don't care, do what you want. Essex Police said, can we settle out of court? And the government wrote a 7-page document claiming that they were wholly neutral into resuming the inquest, but everything within that document was to persuade the coroner not to resume the inquest.
It's quite typical after full criminal trials, and the difference between Sir David's case in Southport is that his killer pleaded not guilty, so there was a full trial. So usually governments don't like to go into things again if there's been a full trial. But the criminal trial did not look into the events that led up to that terrible day.
So this is the failure of PREVENT, effectively, that you're talking about.
And the police.
Yeah, exactly. And the family have huge concerns about the PREVENT program generally, but more specifically, how do you have somebody like Ali Harbour Ali, who's known to the authorities, just be taken for a cup of coffee and then released?
I know this is I totally understand the desire and why you want to do this, right? I absolutely get it. Some may say, look, if the cases are similar to Southport, because they were the failures of PREVENT, then that public inquiry will look at the same issues.
We'd be completely open. So if the government were to announce a wider review into into PREVENT, we would happily join that wider review. But what they've done is they've announced an inquiry into Southport. And they've said that this family can't have its own inquiry. So it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny.
Well, initially Yvette Cooper in October said that she would consider us being involved in that. And then all these months later, she just sends us a letter and says no.
Can I ask you what your dad was like?
Oh, he was absolutely amazing. Kind, compassionate, friendly. He cared about everybody. It didn't matter what their political beliefs were. He just wanted to help people. And he spent his whole life trying to help people. And if he was here now and this had happened to one of his colleagues, he'd be the first person fighting for them. So it just leaves a massive hole in our lives that he's not here. But I'm just trying to take strength from him and think about what he would want me to do. And it's just giving me the courage to speak up and to try and stop this happening to somebody else.
I mean, you can see your love for your dad, coming through. I think he had, how many kids? Was it 5 kids?
Yeah.
So, big family man? Or?
Big family man, loads of animals, just loved everybody, very religious. Many people wrote to us after his passing and said that he was their best friend. And I thought, well, how many best friends can you have? But that's how people felt about him. He was friends with everybody. It didn't matter your race, your religion, your economic status. If you needed help, he was going to help you.
You've done your dad proud.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you both for coming and talking to us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Katie Amess there. We are, of course, talking about more things on the Politics Hub, but I think certainly like a really moving interview. And thank you both very much for being on. Lots more to come on the Politics Hub. I want to start the programme today with a name, a story that I can't get out of my head. The campaign has now started. This is your chance. Tell people. This is the Politics Hub. It's not correct. The tax burden is projected to go up.
No, I am talking about
No, but I'm not. This is my interview. Look, this is ridiculous.
No one does care about us.
I'm really interested in that. On the Politics Hub, we like to push the boundaries. He's got the majority. The question is, what is he going to do with it?
Mayhem in the Middle East, rippling in America's West.
Get back! Get back!
The resolve of these protesters is now being seriously tested. I saw police being forced or pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests.
None of this is a peaceful protest.
I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles. How are you feeling?
I am angry. It is an anti-woman agenda.
Sky News, get the full story first.
Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support, but it's nasty out there.
Can you beat Donald Trump, Governor? President Biden, do you trust President Xi? President Biden says that this meeting went well. He said real progress was made on a whole host of issues. Will your candidates win?
I hope so. I think they will. I think they're great candidates.
There's no doubt that Kamala Harris and her team are harnessing the power of social media. Do you think Kamala is brat?
Kamala's brat.
Are you scared?
Yeah, we were scared. It was terrible. Strong wind, building tearing down.
As them say, our God works, so we can't do nothing.
The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way. Free, wherever you get your news.
Excited. I've had severe nightmares of these people coming in and just taking me in the middle of the night.
Ghislaine Maxwell has pleaded not guilty to all 6 charges against her. Mum, how are you feeling today?
Jeffrey said, you answer to Ghislaine, you just don't cross her.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Now, when your party is descending into civil war, rancour is swelling, your MPs and activists are caught up in briefing and counter-briefing, which seasoned political operative has the diplomacy, the networker-friendly hacks, the interpersonal skills to sort things out? Apparently, Dominic Cummings. Yep, if reports are to be believed, Dominic Cummings is in direct contact with Nigel Farage, talking tactics and sharing tips. So we thought we'd remind you of the man in action.
We're going to have to coarsen our language somewhat. I apologise. You called ministers useless morons. We cannot keep dealing with this horrific meltdown of the British state while dodging stilettos from that. Do you think your description of your colleagues, the way in which you described them, their functions, their abilities, their talents, added to that dysfunctionality?
No, I think the opposite.
There you go, Dominic Cummings. It's like a familiar face coming back. Did you have any run-ins with him?
Oh, well, funnily enough, I remember going to a meeting with him in Downing Street right at the beginning of the pandemic to discuss lockdowns. It's the only time I've ever had anything to do with him. Never met him before, never met him since. But I mean, the Reform Party, as I say, it's a clown show. It's a nest of vipers. Do you really want to get him involved in all that? But you know.
I mean, I guess, the counter-argument is he is a proven winner with the Brexit referendum. He was kind of, Boris Johnson, of course, won. Some people who work closely with him are very, very loyal to him. What do you think, Mercy?
I just think it's a terrible look, really. I mean, I know he has a very popular blog that is keenly followed by many people in the Westminster bubble, really. But when I think of Dominic Cummings, and I think when most people think of Dominic Cummings, and this comes from somebody who was a supporter of the Boris Johnson government in the early days, he just reminds me of the mess that was how the government handled COVID. He just leaves a bad taste in my mouth, quite frankly. So I wouldn't personally sort of bring him back to the political front lines. And I think most of the public, actually, if they started hearing Dominic Cummings all over the news again, they'd probably be rolling their eyes every time.
It's like déjà vu. It's like these familiar
faces. You don't want to be reminded of COVID or Partygate.
It's quite interesting that he's gone to Reform. Maybe he's having conversations with Nigel Farage. I can't, draw too much into it. But I remember, wasn't his big thing saying Farage shouldn't be anywhere near the Brexit referendum campaign because he was too divisive?
Well, I think it's significant for the Tory party, actually, that people like him are going to Reform. One of the things we do at Labour Together is a lot of polling and focus groups, and it is true that Kemi Badenoch is sinking without trace. I think the Tory party, I don't think she'll survive, actually, because there's so many, it's like you were talking about Donor earlier, so many Tories going off to Reform. I mean, Robert Jenrick's basically on his leadership tour, as far as I can tell. I think it just
he
tells
just really
you about...
cares about bins and constituencies that aren't his.
Yeah, doesn't he? Where there's a big Conservative association where you can do a fundraiser for them. Fancy that. Look, you know, I think it does show you how dysfunctional the Tory party has become.
Do you think that's any truth in that?
I mean, I personally don't see any. I think Dominic Cummings wrote in a blog actually that James Cleverly should replace Cummings because it would be the Reform Party's sort of dream because he would just be a yes man. That's what Dominic Cummings said. I don't really see anybody else in the Conservative Party at the moment who would have a hope of transforming the party or who would have a big vision, because Kemi is a vision woman. I would like to see the Conservative Party talking about what that vision might look like. I haven't seen enough of that personally. But I don't think all hope is lost personally. But I would hope that they don't try to court the far right in the process of reforming themselves.
There's one other thing I did want to put to you, because we've been talking a lot on the programme in this chat about the impact reform is having on the Conservative Party. But should Labour have their eye on reform as well? Because they won an awful lot of those constituencies of the Conservatives last time. There's a lot of big reform voters in Labour constituencies.
Labour should not be complacent at all about reform. Reform is a threat to Labour. It's existential for the Tories, in my view, but it's a threat for Labour, and that's why Labour politicians need to continue to point out that Farage wants charges in the NHS.
We got it. We know. You got
and
your
would wave
lines
the
in.
white
I'm not
flag.
letting you do it again.
I'm a line machine. That's what I always do.
Sorry.
I can't break my old habits, can I?
Yeah, no, it's true actually. It's too many morning rounds. That's why you want the Kay Burley gig.
I would love that job.
Thanks both very much indeed. Great to have you on the Politics Hub this evening. That is it from us tonight, though. I will see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Up next, it's a UK Tonight with Sarah J. Mee, and then, of course, at 9 p.m, you've got The World. Today, it's with Gillian rather than Yalda, but that's what you've got coming up, and I will see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Thanks for watching.